If the weather outside is howling and even the simplest winter walk finds you blown off your feet, it is music, books and a corner of an art gallery that will make sure this period of hunkering down is rich, inspiring and sustaining. And so, on this episode of Confect Corner, we'll meet musician Daniela Weinmann, who goes by the moniker Odd Beholder, and whose lyrics often reflect familiar moments of everyday life, making them into things of beauty. We'll join her in her studio on the banks of the River Limmat in the Swiss town of Baden. We'll also be in Burgundy for a site-specific art exhibition called Terra, which delves into the history of the region as an inspiration for avant-garde interventions. And we'll review Irish writer Eimear McBride's new book about love, life, and the demands of careers and relationships. All this and our own tips and itineraries that will help you fill your February with nourishing, life-affirming artistic escapism. This is Confect Corner, and I'm your host, Sophie Grove.
Creating music in my studio sustains me emotionally. During a very long time, it doesn't feel like work.
You know, whenever we're approaching a project, we always ask ourselves, why this? Why here? Why now?
The idea of people who spend their lives looking at others and imagining themselves into the inner world of others, very interesting. And of course, as a writer, I do that as well.
Welcome to Confect Corner. I'm your host, Sophie Grove, here in London, and I'm joined, as ever, by Gillian Tobias here in the studio and by our style director, Marcella Palak in Zurich. Hello to you both.
And to you too, Sophie, and Marcella in Zurich.
Hello, London.
Very grand, hello. No, it's great to get together for the first time in 2025, in fact, and just reflect on that wonderful break we've all had, but also gearing up for a productive year. I usually start the show with a little show and tell. Marcella, what inspirational morsels do you have for us this month?
I have a fantastic piece. I recently spent 24 hours in Vienna and finally visited Indie, the P. Le Mou brand concept store in the first district. I love the colorful pajamas with the great story behind them. Listen to that. French Praline Le Mou's great-grandfather Eugène was a naturalist and a butterfly hunter with one of the largest private collections in the world. In the tropical climate where he traveled, he wore a kind of pajama, the inspiration for today's beautiful collections. So I couldn't resist and had to buy one, of course. I think it's the third, meanwhile. Indigo blue pajama with golden pipings and hussar closures for my lazy Sundays.
Lazy Sundays, yeah, I can see you. Is it a silk pajama?
They are made in India, where Praline's husband, Hari Cherkuri, comes from. And his father opened today's amazing huge shop in Vienna in the 60s already. And he was actually trading in silk, but today's pyjama are in cotton or similar materials, but super nice to wear, really as a summer outfit or, a set for lazy Sundays.
I think, Marcella, you now have to start butterfly hunting and gathering.
I'm not sure about the ethics of that anymore. But it's so, I really like that moment at the end of the day when you, like maybe after dinner, you put your pyjamas on, that sense of complete transformation. I mean, I haven't really pulled it off myself, but the pyjama kind of travel ensemble. I was on the Eurostar the other day and there was this woman wearing silk pyjamas and then beautiful clogs, amazing little bag. She looked absolutely exquisite.
At what time of the day?
It was like after lunch. That was her travel ensemble. Do you ever rock that look, Marcella?
Yes, of course. Or how about the pajama party?
Yes.
I'm dreaming of that. I never did it, but I'm dreaming of that. Everybody's coming with the pajama and we drink champagne and hang around. And why not?
Love it.
So, Gillian, tell me what you've been up to and if you have any inspiration for us today.
Well, yes, I had a wonderful New Year's break in the sort of Sud Tyrol, the hills of the Dolomites, escaped for 4 days and found this gem of a hotel. And You know, we travel a lot and it's often hard to find what is like the perfect hotel. And if you're looking for a retreat, this was it. The Berghofer Inn was the Berghof, handed down through generations, now under the steerage of the daughter. So they added Berghofer Inn to show that sort of female touch to it. They've turned the hotel now into a place with just 13 suites, so smaller, shrunk down in a way the size of it, but expanded that sense of space and a welcome. And it's really, really special because the owner and her husband are really savvy to design. They haven't turned it into a design hotel, but they are passionate about it. So the fabrics from, sourcing from Svens 10 or Kudrat to going to more vintage Austrian textile makers for their fabrics. Lights from Artemidi or antique vintage lights from Floss. There's this incredible, you just felt you were in someone's home who really loves design. What I loved most was there were libraries all over the place, and often in hotels, libraries, books are just for display and decoration. But they literally, Anna, the owner, studied literature and is passionate about books. And they know all the new releases and niche books, whether it's architecture and manners or costume design. There's a whole table full of books on Tracht and dirndls and how do you wear your hair with dirndls. Old books, new books. You sit in front of the fire and there's a pile of books, and it could be the history of the Viennese cafe or a book on poisonous wallpaper design. I mean, just unusual, niche. So it adds to that sense of a passage of time where you really are not hurried. And I think that is really, really rare these days. And what I found that the hospitality there was so on point that I just felt I was wrapped in this warm blanket of care. So I just had this idyllic 4 days and left totally kind of rejuvenated, inspired and rested.
Wow, this is like an oracle of a really wonderful trip when you have to convey it in that amazing way. But I think the books are so interesting. It's like that moment when you're just browsing someone else's, you don't know them very well, but you're kind of browsing their bookshelves and you're getting a measure of them. And it's quite nosy, but there's so much self-discovery in that moment as well.
Sophie, what about you? Where have you been discovering?
Well, I've been, just 2 days ago, I had a bit of an olfactory revelation. I was down in Covent Garden. I went to have a sort of scent profiling moment at Penhaligon's, and it's their new refurbished store. But it was so interesting because it just reminded me how London has always been a centre of scent and sort of adventure in a sense, this point of sort of international exchange. And Penhaligon himself was from Cornwall. He came up to London, set up a kind of barber's on Jermyn Street, and there was a hammam downstairs, and he started becoming inspired by the hammam, and he created his first scent in something like 1872, which was called Hammam Bouquet. And it was obviously inspired by, Constantinople and this kind of great tradition. But then it was so interesting because we were spritzing our way through. There's a scent that is inspired by Constantinople, one by Cairo. They have Halfeti, which is inspired by a black rose of the Euphrates. And it was a way of travelling without going anywhere, because I've been to all those cities and lived in some of those cities, and then I felt transported in this really interesting way.
It's always been one of my special places for present buying, but I never knew that story. I knew it was a heritage firm. The packaging is always beautiful. It seemed to me very traditionally English, but now that I know more about the history.
I brought a scent. So then, in 1902, they made this one for the Duke of Marlborough called Blenheim Bouquet, which is inspired by Blenheim Palace. I'm spritzing it on you there. And Winston Churchill wore this scent. Oh. So it really smells. It's amazing.
Sorry, Marcella, you don't get to smell it.
It's very sort of lemony, lavender, citrus. But it's so interesting to think, what did Winston Churchill smell like? And then I wouldn't imagine he'd smell like citrus. But there's a kind of evocative sense of this, what did the past smell like? And I started reflecting on that. And now every time I feel a bit kind of, like if I want to kind of invigorate the table upstairs in the office, I just spritz the Winston Churchill scent around the place, and everyone feels great.
It's so fresh. But I suppose what it makes you think is that sort of gentlemen in days gone by had that feminine touch, and they
Yeah.
did have that, with their little cravats and their scarves and this beautiful scent that...
Doesn't smell it historic? Because I know there are some scents you think they smell kind of historic. I can't explain it, but it just smells old school. And some old scents smell absolutely contemporary.
Yes.
So doesn't smell it like a little bit dusty?
It doesn't. It's got that because it's so fresh. But I imagine that, in the days gone by, this would be a lifeline to kind of refreshing, just clearing your head in that beautiful way. There's a kind of cleanliness about it, which is almost like a cologne. It's almost like a kind of tonic.
It certainly doesn't smell old-fashioned at all.
But they had some scents there that did smell like an old dusty library, like that musty, gorgeous musk. And I like those as well. So I'll have to take you next time you're in London, Marcella.
Yes, absolutely.
Our first stop today is in Burgundy, a region arguably more known for its wine than for its art. But at its heart lies the village of Baden, located between Dijon and Lyon, which now is playing host to an annual site-specific exhibition.
Called Terra and co-curated by Jen Ellis and Emmy Diamond and produced by Milena Berman, this site-specific exhibition is looking to put the region on the cultural map by taking over historic spaces across Burgundy.
Confex contributor Aisling O'Leary sat down with Jen Ellis, founder of the curatorial platform Apsara Studio, to hear more.
It all started because in 2022, I was the curator for a trip leading a group of patrons and art aficionados from Basel to Kassel to Venice. And Milena Berman was the producer of that trip. And even though we were very much in an art context, I couldn't help but notice that at lunch and dinner, she was picking out wines really thoughtfully. It was as if when she was presented with this menu, it wasn't a foreign land. It was navigating it with knowledge and ease. And I remember cornering her and saying, what is this wine knowledge? And it turns out that, she was from San Francisco, grown up in the Bay Area, but had been living in Burgundy for the last 10 years. And even though at that time, she was really interested in art patron travel, you live in an area that's dedicated to wine, you're going to get into wine in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. You can't miss it.
Can't miss it. Can't miss it. I invited her to pick out the wines for my subsequent openings. The logic being, you've put so much care into the artist you selected, the space where they're showing, the way that it's presented. Like, why would you not also extend that to the sensorial experience of the wine you have in your hand when you're viewing and feeling said art? And at the same time, I'd actually met Emmy Diamond, who is a curator who'd come over from New York, and we share the same sensibility for idiosyncratic locations and really thinking about making spaces sing. Fast forward about 6 months, Milena was bringing up the idea of doing an exhibition in Burgundy, that something like it didn't exist. I was like, okay, well, let's visit. And at that point, I'd never been to Baden, but of course I'd heard of it. And we visited these various, historic locations and just walking around the town. And immediately there was so much potential in terms of the architecture, the pace of the place, its historicity. And so then from there, we started cooking up the idea of launching Terra in collaboration with Emmy as my co-curator and Milena producing it. And so we launched it in 2023. That was the first iteration, and we just opened the second iteration. So it's a yearly thing now.
Excellent. So I know one of the missions of Apsara is underlying ethos is why now? And I was wondering why now for Bone?
So, whenever we're approaching a project, we always ask ourselves, why this? Why here? Why now? And, I think in the terms of like, why this? It's connecting art, heritage, and wine, for lack of a better umbrella term, right? But it's really about the making. So let's say a bit more specific, winemaking. And why here? I mean, there's a common phrase is like all routes lead back to Burgundy. I mean, in terms of the traditions of making, it's been going back for hundreds of years, right? It was a group of monks. It's very much family owned. But then there's also been a new wave of different winemakers coming in. So maybe even if they don't own a parcel of land, they will buy grapes and then be making. So there's this moment right now, I think, of a passing of hands, also an element of innovation in a place that maybe in the past has been quite guarded, right? There is this opportunity and moment for new conversations to be made, whether it be actually within the winemaking community or also openness for other types of creativity to be coming in, right? Such as art. So I think this also leads into the why now, right? You know, sometimes a place just feels ready for it. And even though they might not be initiating something themselves, I think if you go in with sensitivity and ground knowledge so that there's no kind of UFO effect, then you can create something that is beautiful and resonates.
And so the exhibition is a mix of established and also emerging to mid-career artists. Is it important to you to have this dialogue between emerging and established?
Yeah, very important. We have, you know, artists who are also working and represented by galleries and others who are not. We have some works that, yes, are paintings, and then others that are more installatory, and having that mix is really important for the fabric of the exhibition, and I think also the overall dialogue as well as the experience. And one thing that we did this year, which was new to last year, and I think really helped emphasize our emerging artistic voice, was we launched an open call. So there were the three of us, myself, Emmy, and Milena, and we were joined by 6 other jury members that ranged from the worlds of museums to writing to design and architecture. And we had nearly 300 applicants, and we picked 10 people.
Ooh,
and
tough.
Very hard.
Very tough, yeah. What was the theme that they all had to respond to?
They all had to respond to the idea of terroir. And terroir is very much at the core of our exhibition, Terra. And it's a term that, whether you're into wine or even they use it in food now as well, it's about being able to taste place. So this idea that, you know, depending on where something's been grown, what's in the soil, what the temperature was like that day, what were the conditions, who was the person picking it, who was the person cultivating it, you'll be able to sort of trace that back through taste. And I think that that's really interesting also in the context of art, because, you know, you might have the same location and the same set of oils, the same canvas and the same canvas being passed over to various artists, and each one is going to have a different formulation that appears, right? So in that sense, it's maybe not about tasting, but it's about sensing place, it's about experiencing it, it's about expressing it. It was incredible, you know, because we asked the artists, you know, what does terroir mean to you? And we got a myriad of different responses, whether the artists be in Indonesia, Senegal, South America, or in the Jura. They each had something to say about it because it was quite a connecting theme.
Yeah, one can't escape the idea of terroir, terrain, the environment, whether that's external or internal. And so it's on until November 17th across 3 different sites. And I was wondering, what is next for Terra? Do you think there might be more sites involved, or?
So one thing that we are sensitive to with Terra is that maybe not everyone's able to travel to Burgundy to see the exhibition. So we've been thinking a lot about accessibility, like how can you get people to experience it, maybe not verbatim exactly as it would be if it was on site. And so we've partnered with Aura, which is a platform that I co-founded with architect Benny Allen, where we combine art, architecture, and music with a focus on well-being. It's a virtual space, and it was designed by Benny, and it's beautiful. For lack of a better term, you know, it's sort of as if Naoshima met Dia Beacon, met some other locations. So we're going to do a re-articulation of Terra in the virtual realm. And, it's quite incredible. We get 70,000 unique virtual visitors. So I'm kind of excited to see what that leads to. So we kind of joked internally that Terra is traveling to Aura. That's one thing that's going to be happening in the next future. And then we're already working and thinking about next year. We will probably have different sites. There was a difference between last year to this year, but also remain some consistent. And we don't fully know what those sites will be yet. So time will tell. It's a watch this space, literally, situation.
A report there by Aisling O'Leary. Gillian, I want to talk about the power of art to transform a region or a space. Is there a city or a destination you've visited that has surprised you as a cultural hotspot?
Yeah, definitely. Tbilisi, Georgia. I went there a couple of years ago. I was speaking on a panel at the Zeg Festival. Zeg means the day after tomorrow, and this is a festival about storytelling, and storytelling's in architecture, photography, journalism that will matter the day after tomorrow. It's based in Tbilisi, and for the venues, for the talks, for the lectures, for the screening, for the photo exhibitions, we're all over the city. In particular, the main space for the big talks was an old boxing arena, which had a balcony up on top, and you'd imagine that in decades gone by there were boxing matches there. But by gathering people, a lot of Georgians who work in all these different fields of journalism and photography, to meet with international guests in these spaces that are not normally opened up, give you a totally different look on a city. And then we all go back as ambassadors for the city of Tbilisi because we've just had this incredible wand of storytelling in their city. We've experienced it. And so it is good for the city, and it's a wonderful experience as a visitor. Marcella, what about you? This exhibition takes over historic spaces in Burgundy. Now, covering fashion as you do, you must have seen shows in extraordinary venues.
Yes, indeed. And the most impressive locations during Fashion Weeks I discovered, guess where? In Berlin. A former bunker renovated by John Pawson and today home of the Feuerle collection of historic Asian arts, dimly lit. A former multi-story car park in Charlottenburg from 1930s in Bauhaus style. A church, a fully furnished Belle Epoque apartment. It's incredible. It was so interesting and unexpected. And I think such locations create incredibly poetic and unforgettable poetic moments. And this is so important for Fashion Weeks, where you see so many shows and they create movies in your head and you never will forget them. And how about you, Sophie? What are some of the most inspiring ways that you've seen art transform a space?
Wow. I mean, it's so interesting, especially at this time of year, when you really feel immersed in art. It can be really almost like a medicine because the landscape can be quite taxing and almost a bit monotonous. And then suddenly you break out. I remember once I went to, a few years ago, a light festival in Durham, which is a city in the north of England. And they had this incredibly sort of avant-garde program. So you'd just be walking along the river and really in pitch dark, and then there'd be some damn flavin lights just wedged into an old dustbin. But you just felt sort of so moved by it and so changed by the juxtaposition between all of the light sculptures and this dark city in the middle of winter in Britain. So I think that we respond more than ever to those interventions at this time of year.
I love the idea of light because there's something quite magical about light in the urban environment. I think the Chinese do it very, very, very well, but I think in any urban space, it can have such a huge impact.
I mean, even the other day, I was just walking in Canary Wharf with my family, and it was very dreary and we were all super tired. Then we got to Stratford Station and Camilla Wahala had done this huge installation, just walking along this kind of tube, really, to get to the tube. And it was just so dynamic, so strange, spatially. It was just patterns. It was completely a revelation for all of us, and we felt completely energized by it. And I think that those everyday sort of moments when art intervenes and makes you feel alive are so exciting. To some extent, all artists are odd beholders, people with a tangential, illuminating perspective on reality. But there's something to Daniela Weinmann, who goes by the moniker Odd Beholder, and her lyrics that speak of a particular talent for seeing familiar moments of everyday life and making them into things of beauty.
Her melancholy but energetic music has an elegant and complex quality that suits those vignettes. All her albums, the latest of which is titled Feel Better, share that bittersweet but enthralling nature.
Convex deputy editor Chiara Rumella met Odd Beholder in her studio, a former industrial building on the banks of the river Limmat in the Swiss town of Baden. There they talked about the importance of specificity in writing and the joy inherent in making music.
The Swiss town of Baden is crystal clear and freezing on the morning that I arrive at Odd Beholder's studio, perched inside a former industrial space on the banks of the river. It's a sublimely quiet space where you can easily imagine losing yourself on the piano, surrounded by nature, so it feels natural to start digging into the musician's creative process, whether it's impacted by these surroundings and the people around her.
You don't look much older than in 1999.
So I start by asking her an apparently simple but challenging question. Does she think she's an introvert or an extrovert?
We thought our love would never die in your car singing harmony.
It's an astonishingly hard question to answer. I think I'm an introvert. That's my baseline. But I really enjoy people. I'm not a misanthrope. I think people are great. I think it's more of a sensory issue. Like, I'm very perceptive, and sometimes I just get like, my head is just overloaded with colors and impressions, and it's more like that. It's not that I get tired of people. I get tired of my eyes and ears. And I need time to unwind and be in a more calm space. The same goes for performing. I think I can be quite straightforward, and I love making jokes, and I love being, a performer in a way. But also I'm a person who is also very self-reflective maybe, and so I often find it really absurd what I'm doing. So I can be quite awkward as well. I think creating music in my studio sustains me emotionally. During a very long time, it doesn't feel like work. And then there is the work part as well, of course. But it feels so gratifying to create music. But performing can be so rewarding as well. But it's like a lot more stress for me, and it's a lot more taxing somehow. But then again, the feeling of like pure bliss and happiness and adrenaline and everything is, I would say, long-term happiness is producing short-term happiness, and adrenaline and stress and all these things is performing.
Although it's just a simple chemical reaction.
In the albums and EPs she's released, that creative impetus and perceptive nature has been clearly put to good use for a sonic result that's profound but also light-footed and always very poignant. I proceed to ask whether she feels inspiration comes from external sources or from deep within.
I don't think it comes from the outside, but it comes from the inside. But the insides are just as cosmic and ununderstandable and like inexplicable. You reveal yourself to yourself in a way that you don't, you surprise yourself often. You're like, oh shit, do I really worry about this? Or, oh, is this going on? Like, you write a song and then you just start to cry and you're like, oh, suddenly I realize this is happening. This is, this is going on inside of me, but I don't necessarily know that when I start writing. It's one of the most intimate things that goes on when people write a song. It's like, even if they don't intend to give you their diary, it's suddenly, it's so telling. Like, even though it's not really what's going on in their lives, I mean, it's also about fantasies and like fiction. But I think fiction is also really revealing, because your fantasies tell a lot about yourself.
Let's stay out here tonight. I'm scared of the people.
And yet, despite this therapeutic potential, much of Odd Beholder's music is actually supremely danceable and can feel melancholy, energetic and upbeat all at once.
I hope maybe this at least energetic thing that you feel is my pure joy of making music. Like, I really love making music, and I'm in my happy space when I do it. And I think this translates as well to the music, that there is beauty or a need for beauty, or like an interest in aesthetics, or some form of care there as well. So, and I'm definitely not a nihilistic person. I think I get really sad and deep and all these things, but I think these struggles come from a place of care and like love, maybe even, because I think I really relate to this planet and to the people and creatures on it. And yeah, it comes from a very passionate place that is also full of hope, but also full of fear, I think. But it's not like, I'm not pessimistic in a strict sense, I would say.
If you listen closely, there are echoes of other hugely successful artists in this double-edged approach of hers.
Sharing a blanket in this form.
Well, when I was maybe 14, 15 years old, I would discover, first on my own, but also with my friends, a lot of artists like PJ Harvey or Portishead or Björk, or then later also Radiohead and Cat Power, and that was like a big revelation for me. And I think this was how I got introduced to this whole producing thing, because I grew up learning the guitar. Like, I learned the guitar because my father would always play little blues music for us children and like taught me how to play the basic chords. And so I was really guitar and even rock focused when I was a child. And I think these artists, just the ones that I mentioned, they are kind of a transition towards electronic music, because music production kind of entered the rock music world with these artists, and so I got really fascinated by these sounds. I think the productions of Björk, for example, they sounded like something else, like alien music to me. And I think from this moment I already had like an electric guitar and I was like playing in a proper band, but I was always looking for these alien sounds.
But it wasn't until later that she really embraced her solo career.
Because I started touring when I was 30 years old, which was like, yeah, it's a silly, like in terms of music business, it's a very silly decision to become a musician that late. But it is also a symptom, I would say, of how the music industry was when I was young, because there were no female role models in Switzerland that I could look up to I didn't know about all these cool punk bands like Kleenex and Lilliput. They were too underground, so I wouldn't, I didn't grow up in the cultural scene, so I didn't know about these role models. And all the other musicians weren't visible. The female musicians weren't visible. It took me a long time to realize this isn't a transient phase. Like, I cannot run away from it. I felt like I have to do it. And I think I could only do it when I was grown up, really properly grown up.
Isn't it a dream, boy? Atlantic flight, spinning our future. Not a single cloud inside.
The choice of her moniker at the time was also very telling. Odd Beholder is a very evocative name in and of itself, and it's very representative of this musician's approach to the world and to her craft.
I think the term Odd Beholder kind of originated in a time where I was very shy, very shy. And I think it's something a lot of people who write often, because not only I don't only care about film a lot, but I also read like a lot of literature, and I write as well. And I think I've been writing more at the time as well, and I felt like a writer basically, and I felt like this odd person standing in the corner of like a pool party taking notes, mental notes mainly, but like too awkward to really interact with the people, but like in this observer state, and also a bit locked into this observer state, and it was a bit painful at the time, and I'm really glad that I kind of open up a bit more now. I think one value that I have, and I think you could hear it when I was talking about how dark the music is that subjectivity is really underrated and perception is not perceived. We perceive constantly, and there is no fixed grid. Like, people are vastly different and they see things very differently. And so beauty, for example, isn't something that can be objectively measured or like defined and caged somehow, fixed. But it's something very floating, and it always appears in a context, and it also really relies on beholders. So an odd beholder is also somebody who perceives maybe beauty in an odd way, or odd things seem beautiful for this person. And yeah, I think it's maybe a way of celebrating both the introvert, but also like a subjectivity, like celebrate subjectivity. I think I'm really in love with specific stuff. I love specificity because I think there's so much stuff in our life. Like, we have cups of tea, and we have shoes, and we have, we are in a supermarket, and I think these everyday objects and situations, they are so defining actually for our everyday lives. And I think sometimes they become like vehicles for how we feel or how we are, or like these situations I think are so relatable. For example, this whole supermarket thing is like, I think it's almost a trope. Like, everyone I know has at some point seen their ex-boyfriend with someone else in the supermarket. It's just it's a thing, it happens. Yeah, if you zoom in like that, somehow I get closer to my feelings if I tell you when and where they occur, and what I'm holding in my hands and what I'm wearing. Somehow these superficial things help me connect with the really deep stuff. Even, I could say like I'm heartbroken, but sometimes it's easier to say I'm staring at the black screen of my phone, and it means kind of the same thing.
Try to look at the world through Odd Beholder's perspective, and you'll soon realise there is a lot more to the little things that surround us than what meets the eye, and her music is a portal to understand just that. For Confect in Baden, I am Chiara Rimella.
I needed to cope with all the harm.
Odd Beholder there, in conversation with Confect's deputy editor, Chiara Rimella. And pick up your copy of Confect magazine to follow the rest of their conversation. And finally today, we turn to the literary world. The City Changes Its Face by Eimear McBride follows Eileen and Stephen, a couple in London, going through the motions of a rough patch, and flashbacks to their relationships over 3 seasons. With the arrival of Stephen's long-lost daughter, Grace, and his film production taking precedence over their lives, Eileen wonders about the future, and if they even have one.
Eimear McBride is one of the celebrated Irish authors in modern times, and The City Changes Its Face is an immersive experience detailing intimacy with the backdrop of London City in the forefront.
Confex Steph Chungu spoke to Eimear and started by asking her about the early influences in her writing.
I suppose the big one was Joyce. For me, he was, the writer who changed everything. I arrived late at him. I read Ulysses when I was 25, and it was, revelatory for me. And so when I started to write, I felt as though, he had laid down a challenge, which was you could really do anything. There was no rules. There was no particular way you had to go about writing a novel or sacred cows that had to be observed. And that was very freeing, but also quite alarming. And so I kind of brought my own original training as an actor to the writing, and being interested in Joyce and modernism and that type of literature that encourages you to approach it from new and strange angles. I think that was, hugely important for me.
Your new book, The City Changes Its Face, is set in the 1990s. I wanted to know what crossed your mind to set it in that time period, especially.
I think it's an interesting period. It's also, for me, part of my youth was a big part of coming to London in the 1990s, and I'm interested in, what it was like, recalling what it was like to be young in that time and place. I think it also frees me up to concentrate on keeping the intensity between characters in a way that more contemporary setting that becomes dissipated because of things like mobile phones and the internet and social media. And it's much harder, I think, to find intense places for people to interact with each other.
Yeah, there's a certain sense of invasiveness, especially with technology and being advanced. I want to touch on the relationship between Eileen and Stephen. They're in a relationship, but they're both in different periods of their life and work. Eileen is 19, 20, Stephen is 39, 40, but they're both in acting. Would you say that your entry in acting and drama influenced the book for the characters to be in acting themselves?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I find that the idea of people who spend their lives looking at others and imagining themselves into the inner world of others very interesting. And of course, as a writer, I do that as well. But I think with actors, of course, we always assume because we see them and their bodies and hear their voices and feel their emotion, albeit the emotion of their characters, feel we know them much more intimately than, of course, we actually do. And in my experience, a lot of actors are quite different to the characters they portray, and that interests me, that the gap between the inner and the outer. And, with Stephen and Eileen, of course, there's an age gap, which is also, because they have had a lot of similar experiences, it's about looking at different points in a life and how those different points can interact with each other when he sort of knows things that she doesn't yet know, things that he wants to protect her from. And she's also much more open to life in a way that he's much more cautious because he's older. He knows what it's like to be hurt, and he knows what it's like to suffer, I suppose, and over long periods of time. And he's more protective of himself. And it was those two different approaches to life, although they have so much in common as well, not least that they are in love with each other. But that seemed a kind of interesting knot to work through the narrative.
And then we add Grace, who is Stephen's long-lost daughter, into the dynamic, and then we see Eileen's vulnerability as the relationship develops between Grace and Stephen. And we do see moments within the book where she becomes slightly disconnected from reality. What was the purpose of adding Grace into Stephen and Eileen's dynamic?
Well, it was always interesting to add more problems. I like, characters who are kind of difficult people and putting them in more increasingly pressureful situations. And I think if your 17-year-old daughter comes to stay with you and your 19-year-old girlfriend, that's obviously a pressureful situation. And particularly given his own incredibly difficult experience of family, of his own family and his mother growing up, to be in a position where he is not only the father, but also the lover, and how to keep those roles in place and separate. And he doesn't do it very well. He sort of removes himself and creates a barrier between himself and Eileen, and in a way makes her more daughter-like than she has ever been. And she obviously rebels against that as well. And I thought it was also interesting to see two young women kind of working out a very difficult situation between themselves as well.
The book is written in Eileen's point of view, and your writing style is unique. It's like a unique stream of consciousness with the visual aspects. I do want to touch on Stephen's vulnerability through the eyes of Eileen with the film that he's making. It's practically the entire film written in how Eileen sees it, because obviously she's an acting student, so she sees the motions of camera work and film terminology through her mind. What was the writing process for that particular scene?
Well, it was a funny one because I hadn't really planned for that section to happen, and it's quite a big, significant section in the end. And so he's made an autobiographical film. And he hasn't shown it. It's still in the process of being edited. It's not finished yet. Eileen has read the script of it, and she's kind of been very involved in the creative side of it with him, but she hasn't seen a cut of the finished film yet. And Grace has also not seen it, and he's not let her in. He's told her he would send her the script, but then he didn't. And when she asks to see the film, come and see the cut, he won't let her. And eventually they both persuade him. They realize there's more to his refusal, or his being kind of cautious about letting them see it than meets the eye, and that it's really, for them, it's an issue of trust. And also for Eileen, the idea that, he doesn't want Grace to see him in this kind of difficult way that he was during the life of the film. And she understands that, but she also feels that they have a creative relationship, and he should be able to, trust her to be able to see the kind of the work of art that's been made, and not just the autobiography that's within it. And so I originally thought I would just have them go to the screening room and maybe describe a few little scenes, but mostly it would be about their reactions to it, about his discomfort with Grace seeing him doing certain things, or, asking Eileen to kind of interject and explain certain things to make it feel more technical and less personal and less close to him in front of his daughter. But actually, once I sat down and started to write, I realised that would be cheating. And that I was going to have to write the whole film, which I hadn't planned at all, of course. And then found myself really having to, not only write a novel, but then sort of write this film, which is not like the rest of the novel, is not written from Eileen's internal monologue, but is written from the perspective of what she can see, what is sort of her mind absorbing what she sees and how she understands it, but not how she feels about it or anything like that. It's very much a description of the film. So it just it came out of the blue. And I realised I was going to have to do it, and that it would, in a way, be cheating to just skip through it.
The author Eimear McBride there in conversation with Confect's Steph Chungu. The City Changes Its Face is published by Faber and Faber and is out in early February. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Confect Corner. My thanks to Marcella Palak in Zurich and to Gillian DePius for joining me here in London. Confect Corner is produced and edited by Carlotta Ribello and Steph Chungu. Remember to pick up your copy of the winter issue of Confect magazine, which is out on all good newsstands now. Until next time, from me, Sophie Grove, goodbye and thanks for listening.